Raiding in World of Warcraft has journeyed a pretty long way. I mean, keep in mind that while we have complex looking raids like Nighthold or Blackrock Foundry, that at one point, we were killing bosses in a freaking cave. Yeah, there was a lot of caves in early WoW. A lot of bosses in them. But even with its huge improvements in certain areas, it's hard to ignore the monumental feats that raids across all of WoW have made. Expansive size, unique environments, fun and challenging boss designs. Raids at a variety of points in WoW's history have made huge accomplishments, and some pretty astonishing failures. That's right, even though there's a lot of great additions to the raid roster, there's a bunch, and I mean a bunch, of bad apples to go along with them. Raids that lack compassion or just downright offensive. With the raids of WoW being so up and down so often, I think a good ranking is in order, but since there are so many, I thought it would be best if I rank them per expansion, from best to worst. Starting, of course, with Vanilla WoW. Keep in mind, this is my list and isn't meant to infringe on your feelings towards any one raid. We all have different opinions after all. Well, let's start the Vanilla WoW raid ranking video off with the best of them all. It wasn't all that surprising to me when I started compiling this list that Naxx 40 would end up smack at the top of it. It has it all. Challenging but fun raid bosses, an expansive raid layout that is still to this date one of the biggest raids that we've ever had, really cool and frankly frightening environment designs, and a lot, and I mean a lot, of content to enjoy. As I mentioned earlier, the bosses are challenging, but it was the step into the more creative and fun direction that really improved the formula. With bosses like Hygen the Unclean's unique dance mechanic, or swapping polarities in the Thoughties encounter, there was a lot of unique and varied boss design decisions here. Whether you were farming for frost resist gear or working on one of the many challenging raid bosses, Naxx 40 was a huge step in a new direction for raiders, and I think we all frankly enjoyed the change. Sad not many people got to experience this Leviathan in its prime, but lucky Blizzard revisited it in Wrath of the Lich King, and even more lucky for players will be probably seeing it pretty soon in Classic WoW. Did I mention it was scary? Following up on the heels of my best raid choice, I went with something a little bit more toned down and simpler. So of course it had to be Zul'Gurub. A monumental step in an interesting direction, Zul'Gurub attempted to do what the Dungeon Dire Maul had done before it, by allowing players access to catch-up gear in an attempt to keep the blood pumping on this new MMO juggernaut. You see, raiding in vanilla was very time-consuming, and if you fell behind, it could be quite taxing to catch up. Enter Zul'Gurub, a 20-man troll dungeon that assists raiders with a challenging but rewarding way of catching up with future content, while still offering some pretty solid gear for existing hardcore raiders. But hey, that's just the elitist flavoring. What about the raid? From its charming outdoors environments that we hadn't really seen up until that point, to its very open raid layout, all the way to its pretty solid boss designs, Zul'Gurub really helped to shape the future groundwork that Naxx would lay down, showing that not every raid had to be hard as balls, at least without having a little fun splashed in every now and then. Oh, and you can also mount inside, which was a much needed first for raiding up until that point in my opinion. AQ40 is an extremely memorable raid. In fact, people who never even remotely saw it in content know it all too well. In a lot of ways, it's famous, or in some cases, infamous. It's cool yet creepy raid design mixed with some really nice Egyptian-esque flavor, topped off with a sweet showdown against the old god Cthulhu, and you have the makings of a pretty solid set of content. Well, mostly. Some of the bosses were just too overtuned or downright broken, and worse, some of the trash in AQ40 was harder than some of the bosses. Not to mention the nasty grind for nature resist gear just to down some of the bosses. I'm looking at you, princess. Oh god, I'm looking at you. But even with those negatives tugging at it, AQ40 still managed to be an extremely epic experience. I mean, come on, getting your first Karaji battle tank was super epic, and some of the bosses like Twin Emperors or Ouros are too intense not to love no matter how much they kicked our butts back in the day. We're kinda floating at the middle of the pack now, so raids are slowly teetering into the danger zone. And Blackwing Lair is no exception. Blackwing Lair has a lot of good things going for it. It's got some really nice mechanics in several of its boss fights, like Razor Gore, who's really neat in the fact that you just actually control the boss. Like, that's really cool. Or Nefarian, who punishes each individual class in his own way. I mean, come on, being like a hunter and having your bow broken because Nefarian yells at you, that's crazy. It's just something we've never really seen emulated in future raids. And the loot all looked really cool in BWL too. Like, I think the tier 2 set looks great on most classes. Plus you got Ahn'qiraj, which is a really cool looking two-handed sword. But that's about all I can really say nicely about BWL. It was at times an overtuned mess, the layout was boring and linear, and the design, oh god, the design. Yay, more oranges and red. Not like we haven't seen that a crap ton throughout the expansion already. But hey, why not put some more here? BWL isn't a bad raid, far from it really, but you can definitely see Blizzard was still trying to figure out their footing, and clearly they hadn't found it yet. Up next is a controversial pick for me in AQ20. I actually really like AQ20, but I can understand why it's so close to BWL into the negatives. I enjoy both of those raids quite a bit, but in the end they both suffer greatly, and both have very similar pros and cons. AQ20's bosses are pretty good, none of them really offend, and the design is in some ways actually an improvement over BWL. But you see, my big issue with AQ20 is that it feels so very tacked on. In comparison to its big brother raid AQ40, it feels shallow and lacking any real identity. Compared to ZG, a 20-man raid that came out a few patches before, and it feels like they weren't really trying. Like, AQ40 feels like it got all of the developers' energy. The layout is okay, but it's overly simplistic in nature, the design is just AQ40 light, and overall in general the experience is kinda lackluster and forgettable. It's not that AQ20 is bad, it's that it's barely there at all. We're at our bottom 2, and Ahn'qiraj is our runner-up for the worst raid in vanilla WoW. What can I say about Ahn'qiraj that isn't super obvious? It's a one-boss rush in a fiery cave with a couple of trash mobs. Yeah, the boss is pretty good, and it's really memorable when you think about it. I mean, it's one of those raids that everyone kinda goes back to a little bit. But that's really all it's got going for it is one decent boss fight. The instance is boring, and there's just not a lot of content to it. It lacks any real hard labor, like the instance was more than likely slapped together overnight. Ahn'qiraj was going to be my worst raid of vanilla WoW before I ended up sparing it that pain, mainly because it did the same for us. It spared us the pain. Because even if it was lackluster, at least it was over quick enough that it never became offensive. The worst vanilla raid of all time just so happens to be the vanilla raid most people remember best. Molten Core. Now maybe that'll ruffle some feathers, me slapping the nostalgia beast known as MC at the bottom of my list, but I have my reasons. I mean, they didn't call it Molten Snore for nothing. Molten Core's biggest issue is that, for better or worse, it's offensive. And that's the worst thing you can do when you're trying to entertain an audience of people, is just beat them down. The boss fights are uninspired and lack any real critical thinking. The layout is big and open, but not in a creative way that encourages exploration. It was overflown with trash that respawned half the time before you even downed a boss. The environments were boring and drab to the point where I hated the color orange and red by the time I was done. And overall, to make it worse, all of it was crammed into one of WoW's longest raids, meaning that it wasn't going to be over anytime soon once you started. I hope you liked grinding rep just so you could do half the bosses, because that's what you were going to be doing. And man oh man, did it suck. I know it was supposedly crafted in less than a week, and I'm happy we had it as a jumping off point, but that doesn't spare it in retrospective from my disdain. At least Ahn'qiraj was a cool boss, or else I don't think Molten Core would be loved nearly as much. Well, that's my ranking of all the vanilla WoW raids. Stay tuned for my future expansion raid ranking videos, as well as some dungeon ranking videos I'll be doing afterwards. If you enjoyed my content, why not subscribe, like the video, and check out some of my other videos. Hey, as always, I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.